When it comes to trials and modifiers, this does have the semblance of being a good system in Tower Defense Simulator. However, the developers, I feel like they've fucked it up. Not too badly to the point where this is unplayable, but to the point where this is kind of become repetitive, and it replaces the challenge map system, which, even though it was flawed, it actually might be considered slightly more fun than the current system that we have in Tower Defense Simulator. Now, I'm not really too opposed to the mechanics of the trials in the first place, in that you have to play a map with a certain modifier, and you earn that modifier to play in Tower Defense Simulator regular matches, and you gain a slight boost in your rewards. So, for the example that I've completed 2 challenge maps. Now, for some reason, I'm not actually able to load into any maps to prove that I've completed Fog and Innovation. So you are just going to have to believe me on this, but I have completed 2 challenge trials in Tower Defense Simulator. But the thing is, there are 18 trials in Tower Defense Simulator that you can do. That's fine and dandy, that's 18 choices, and they reset every 3 hours, meaning that you always have like a different trial. You're more than likely to have a different trial every couple of hours or so, to the point where if you join the game every day and just play casually, it's going to take you a good while to get all of the trials. However, I mistakenly believed that each trial was attached to a random map. That's actually not the... What the hell? This man's wearing a known drug user's shirt. So each trials is set to a certain map. So for example, Speedy Enemies is set to Wrecked Battlefield, Glass is set to Stained Temple, Quarantine is set to Dusty Bridges, Fog is set to Winter Abyss, Limitation Makes Creativity is set to Coral Deep, etc, etc, until Healthy Enemies, where that map is set to 4 seasons, and then it resets over to Speedy Enemies. So firstly, not only is the trials not randomized, the map isn't randomized either. The map is associated with the trial. And as you can see, the trials themselves, they go in a set order, which I'm not really too opposed by, but I'm opposed to the map itself being attached to the trial, because that means that eventually people can just play the map over and over again, and after completing every single trial here, it kind of gets a bit repetitive when you do it on the same map. Now, I've said with the new challenge trial system that if it was a random map, so if it was Speedy Enemies, but it could have been on like Mason Arch, or it could have been on Sacred Mountains, I think that would have been better, because not only does that mean that there is a way around people strategizing around a certain map being played, such as is the case now, because Speedy Enemies is always going to be on wrecked battlefields, so people can say, right, so you can place towers in this specific spot, or you can use these towers to counter these specific enemies, for example. Which basically means that there's just going to be 18 new strategies for each of the trials, which even though some people may disagree with me on this, I don't think that's fun at all. I don't think using strategies is fun. I think using your innovative mind is fun. So that's why I think random maps should be a thing for trials, but so be it, I guess. However, even with this, there are some things that is not really polished with trials. So for example, the Glass trial map, initially, it was Mason Arch. However, because many people were complaining about the fact that you can't really beat Mason Arch on your own, you can beat Glass on Mason Arch with a lot of other players, the developers decided, okay, so it's too hard, we're just going to change it over into Stained Temple. Additionally, the one thing I find annoying is that if you play a challenge trial and you were to lose during it, you actually get 0 rewards, even 0 XP. And I think when people are wasting their times on modifiers, punishing them with 0 experience and 0 coins just feels like a slap in the face, and that's not really a way to encourage players to continue playing trials. I think it's the case, I think it should be the case, where there should be a small amount of reward. Perhaps not a major amount, and it probably shouldn't scale up to do something similar to Fallen Mode, to the point where the challenge trials could be used as a replacement for Fallen Mode. But I think there should be some level of reward if you were to lose on Wave 40, for example. You just die to, say, the Champion Templar. Obviously, this is carried over from the challenge maps, which had and inherited the same exact system where if you were to lose on any point of the game, you'll get 0 XP. However, the most annoying thing about challenge trials is the fact that it just feels so unpolished, because when challenge trials were first added to Tower Defense Simulator, skills were disabled on everything but speedy enemies. The developers did enable it afterwards, but it just seemed a little bit rushed, to the point where the developers only tested the first challenge trials and saw that it did have skills correctly enabled, but then when it moved on to the next challenge trial and skills weren't enabled, the developers just completely forgot about it because they never tested for it. And the lack of testing was actually later proved by the head QA lead. So Nimothy said, did the testers even test this, in reference to the trials? And he said that we didn't really test it. It wasn't even in QA until like the day before it dropped. So if the update was made on the Wednesday, it would have been the Tuesday where things were added to the testing server which Tower Defense Simulator uses for its testers. And as you may know, there are 18 new modifiers that were added to Tower Defense Simulator, meaning that yes, it's basically impossible for all of the testers to try out every single one of these modifiers to see if they actually fit in with the game. So that's why a lot of these modifiers, I think they're actually just too easy now. So for example, the limitation makes creativity thing, it being on Coral Deep, is just too easy in my opinion. And all of these trials can easily be cheesed with, say, the military base, say the mercenary base, say a combination with like the golden soldier and maybe the medic and the accelerator, for example. There's not really too much strategy when it comes to this. Just use these specific towers and you'll be fine and dandy. I don't really like that either, but it would have been better if the map was randomized. But also, there are some leftover things. So, for example, the limitation makes creativity modifier. It's implied that with this modifier enabled, it reduces the amount of towers that you can place down to 20, but it disables all of the placement limits for all of the towers in Tower Defense Simulator. That is what the description for limitation makes creativity in the lobby suggests it would be. Total tower number is reduced by 50% is actually the thing that's associated with this, meaning that if you were, say, in a server of 4 people, your tower limits will be reduced to, say, 10 or maybe 11 or 12, maybe even 15, if you have the skills enabled for that. However, the game just doesn't mention this. I think that there was a last-minute change for this. People realized it's actually too easy, or the developers realized it would be too easy if we were to give the accelerator unlimited placements. So just decided, okay, we're just going to make it total tower number is reduced by 50% and that's it. But then it's things like quarantine as well, where the placement footprint of a tower is increased by 10 to the point where you have to spread out all of your towers. But in Dusty Bridges, where this trial is enabled, it has issues when it comes to level stacking, where you can place down any ground tower, say around here in this spot here, where you can actually stack a load of towers here, because if you were to stack continually up, given the fact that all of these levels are slightly above each other, the game wouldn't recognize the placement footprint for each tower, meaning that yes, you can stack about 5 towers in this limited spot here, whereas ordinarily it should only be 1 or 2 towers. And then there's also this tower here, where due to a glitch, you can stack up towers right alongside the side of this tower. Meaning that, yes, there are ways that you can cheese around the limitation makes creativity match. Which means that you can cheese around the fact that the placement footprint for a tower may be increased by 10, but you can still place down towers near each other so long you can stack them, which is ironic given the fact that the developers want to actually reduce the amount of stacking in Tower Defense Simulator. And like I said previously, because there is a lack of maps where you can do these trials, it means that the game gets really boring after you completed everything, but also it gets really boring when you're just waiting around for the modifier that you're missing to just come around, which it will eventually after like 3 days. And it's just not fun, if I'm really being honest. I think having a random map does encourage players to play outside their comfort zone. Like, yeah, sure, the 18 maps selected aren't like conventionally easy maps to complete the game modes on, but if it was to be a random map, not like a completely random map, like for example Mason Arch, if you were to introduce that to every single modifier, people would actually complain because that map is extremely difficult. I made it difficult on purpose. But if you were to increase the pool of maps which a trial could be selected for, I think that's a better system, and it not only encourages players to play more maps, but it also adds an element of challenge to it, to where you can't strategize for a certain map. I think that would be more fun. But we'll just have to wait and see if the developers do that, because as of right now, I don't really like the challenge map system. I think it is a little bit flawed. Also, when it comes to the challenge trial wave structure, it's basically the same wave structure repeated for every single trial. It's just a modified version of Fallen mode that I think is more in line with Legacy Fallen mode. The only problem is, there is like zero modification to what happens in reality because, well, the developers don't seem to have modified the wave structure for each individual trial. The only thing that's changed between each trial is the modifier. So, for example, if this was the hidden enemies modifier, it would mean that these enemies that spawn in, they would be hidden instead of what they are right now, which is no modifier applied. The only modifier that's applied here is just that the base health is set to 1. And to be fair, when you're playing the same map over and over, not really the same map, but when you're playing the same game mode, theoretically, 18 times, just with a simple modifier applied to it, it does become really, really repetitive really quickly.